He did. And Will and Kate very much did shine a light for kind of a new generation on the royal family. But that is extended even into kind of popular culture. There's a show called The Royals, which is a drama about a royal family. There is controversy, there is intrigue, there is scandal, as these essentially shallow and vain characters vie for power within their family. That idea of royalty, of being about power and being about authority, is quite common. Today is the last Sunday in the church year. It is next week, we kind of reset the clock a little bit, and we start again. Today, we turn our eye on the reign of Christ. We think about what it means for Jesus to be king, to be royal, to be the monarch of the church and of our lives. Now, in the world, and in kind of pop culture programs, being the one who reigns is about being the one who wields the power. That's what we see in Pilate. But of course, that's not what we see in Jesus. We have this wonderful depiction, I think, of two kingdoms, Jesus and Pilate coming together and having a little bit of a showdown. And in seeing how Jesus responds to the power of the world, which bears down upon him, I think we see the full force of the way of God. Here in this small conversation in the Gospel of John between Jesus and Pilate, we see what characterizes the kingdom of Christ, the manner in which Jesus rules. And out of that, then, we see the way of life in which we are called to live as his subjects and as his followers. I invite you to pick up your pew Bibles and turn to John 18. That is around page 117 of the back half of your Bible. Now it's a very small conversation between Pontius Pilate and Jesus, but I think it's instructive in many ways. We see that the way of Jesus' kingdom is the way of sacrificial love, first and foremost. Jesus stands before Pilate as the one who gives up his life. The way of Jesus is not a way of wielding force and dominance, but it's a way of laying oneself down. Now, even though Jesus is God incarnate, even though he is Lord of heaven and earth, even though he is the one whose dominion will never pass away, whose kingdom will never be destroyed, even though he could at any point call down thousands upon thousands of angels and just decimate all of Pilate's plans, he doesn't. Jesus submits to the authority of worldly power in order for the love of God, which is the bedrock of God's kingdom, to be made known in people's lives. There is quite this contrast here between these two kingdoms. The kingdom of the world, as represented by Pilate, is one of might and dominance. Pilate summons Jesus to him. He demands answers. What have you done? What is your kingdom? Pilate points to the fact that Jesus has been handed over to him. Pilate sees Jesus as one whose life is being stripped away. It's being taken. His freedom is being removed. He says, it is your people, it is your chief priests who have handed you over to me. In another gospel, Pilate is noted as saying, don't you know that I have the power to condemn you or to set you free? The kingdom of the world is the one where might is right. Whoever has the most power, whoever has the most authority, wins. It's a way of power where you need to fight for the maintenance of your kingdom. But the way of Jesus is different. The way of Jesus is not found in subverting the power of another, but in giving himself for it. It's the way of service. It's the way of sacrifice. Jesus stands not as one whose life is being taken from him. He stands as one whose life is being willingly laid down in love. Jesus takes the insults, he takes the persecution, he takes the blows, and he does not retaliate from them in any way. He absorbs the world's violence into himself so that a better way can be shown. We often talk about the cross as a supreme example of what God's kingdom is about, but that is also even shown here in this small conversation. Jesus displays in a magnificent way what the way of God means. That it is a way of love, not hate. It is a way of peace, not violence. Jesus says, "My kingdom is not of this world. If it were, my servants would fight to prevent me being handed over." And in fact, we see that very thing. Right? Just a few passages before ours, still in chapter 18, we see soldiers coming to the Garden of Gethsemane to arrest Jesus. And Peter, who is famous for understanding Jesus halfway, but not the other half, takes his sword and cuts off the high priest's servant's ear. Peter thinks that in some way, the authority of Jesus, the way of Jesus, the life of Jesus needs to be protected, it needs to be defended. And how do you protect and how do you defend against a violent kingdom which is coming against you? Well, you need to act violently. So he cuts off the ear. But the kingdom of Jesus is not the kingdom of the world. And it doesn't subscribe to the world's twisted understanding of what power means. Jesus heals the soldier's ear, and he reprimands Peter for acting violently. Because the way of Jesus, the way of his reign, is a way of love, giving oneself for the life and the salvation of others, allowing oneself to be rejected, to be hated, even persecuted, in order to shine the light of God's activity and presence in this world. To show in the midst of a dark kingdom that there is a better way. Early church history used to have a phrase that said, "The blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church." In the history of the Christian church, you would see people go towards their execution. And the reason why the blood of the martyrs was the seed of the church, it wasn't because their death was anything special. It was because in the midst of a violent world and violent kingdoms, they stood up in the face of that and declared, not by their violence, but by their peace and by their sacrifice, that God's way was a better way, that there was a better way to be a people and to live this world. God's way is a way of peace, not aggressively rallying against others or fighting to dominate them. Jesus' way does not respond to violence with equal measure or greater measure as a deterrent or a lesson. That's Rome's way. That was the Roman way. That's the world's way. But Jesus lives out love and lives out the very type of love which by the world's standards is shameful and mockable. That's exactly what Jesus does. But notice in this conversation who is actually in control. Here's a hint. It's not Pilate. Pilate thinks he is. He thinks he's the man. He thinks he's got all the power in the world. He summons Jesus. He demands to know what he's done. He demands to see what his kingship is, but he's not. Jesus says, "If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would fight to keep me from being arrested," which points to the fact that Jesus is arrested not because the other side won, but because there is something bigger going on. Jesus says, "In fact, for this reason I was born, and for this I came into the world, to testify to the truth of God's presence, the truth of God's way of living that brings healing and wholeness to a fractured world, the truth of love and peace. Jesus is saying to Pilate, you might think that you're top dog, but this is way beyond you. Worldly kingdoms are so horrifyingly narrow-minded. Have you ever noticed that? It's about this battle. It's about this win. It's about getting our way or forcing others to do what we want right now. It is the instant gratification and a power of the moment. The way of Jesus points to a larger reality. And that is why Jesus can give himself in loving sacrifice. Because salvation, because the love of God, because the peace of Christ is always more expansive, it's more fulfilling, it's more enriching than any of our worldly satisfactions. As I said last week, the bigger reality of which we recognize today on Christ the King, the reign of Christ Sunday, is that after everything is said and done, even in the midst of all the darkness, Jesus wins. So how do we live in the way of Jesus? Because the reign of Christ, Christ the King Sunday, is not just about an end-time theme. It's about a way of living that is available to us all today. And we, as followers of Jesus, are invited, we are called to live out the very kingdom of Jesus, the kingdom that we see displayed in this gospel reading. How do we live out the sacrificial love of Jesus? One of the curious things that occurs sometimes in faith communities is that we begin to define ourselves by what we are against. We try to protect ourselves from wrong thoughts or, sadly, wrong people or wrong issues. But is that the way of Jesus? We can imagine this scene of heaven where Jesus invites us into his kingdom and says, "How did you invite others into my love?" Well, I argued with some people, and I fought this issue very, very well. No. How did you invite others into my love? See, it was God's explosive love for us. A love so great that Jesus was willing to stand in the messiest of places. It's that expresses the truth of what life is to be like. Sometimes we need to put down the desire to be right so that we can maintain the relationship of love. Because living in the presence of God's love and peace is always more important than just getting another brick for our own kingdom. Do we desire so much that others experience the presence of Jesus? And that is the main thing in which our hearts rejoice, not just as a church, but also as individuals. Is there a fight that you need to put down? Is there an enemy that you need to forgive? Is there a last word that you are not called to have? This way of living, it is so countercultural that we may listen to this. It's so against what the world kind of has that we may listen to this and think, well, none of this really makes sense. Because after all, if you don't get the last word, then you don't win the argument. And if you're going to have an argument, you better win. Right? That's what the world says. Why would I forgive my enemies? They're my enemies. And I don't want anything to do with them. That's what the world says. But this is the very way in which Jesus established his kingdom. And it is the very way that we are called to live out his kingdom. And actually doing that is the very means by which God's kingdom will again be made real upon this earth, fully. And the reign of God will exist from everlasting to everlasting. May our lives be an expression of that kingdom. May we live out the fact that Christ is our King and we live in his reign. Amen.